Good afternoon. My name is Bob Shapiro. I'm president of the Academy of Political Science and a professor at Columbia University, and also the editor of the journal Political Science Quarterly. I'd like to welcome you all to our Academy of Political Science Forum. These quarterly forum events use as their takeoff point a recent article or research review in the journal Political Science Quarterly. The discussion today will be moderated by Dr. Mary-Lena Mantis, who's the associate editor and managing editor of Political Science Quarterly and a lecturer at Sacred Heart University. Before I turn the floor over to Dr. Mantis, I just want to remind the audience that you can participate by typing your questions in the Q&A box, and Dr. Mantis will get to the questions in due course. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Mantis.
Thank you, Professor Shapiro. On behalf of the Academy and its journal, Political Science Quarterly, allow me also to take a moment to welcome you all to today's forum. This forum is one of a series, as Shapiro noted, that seeks to highlight and spotlight and feature further timely articles published in Political Science Quarterly. Today, we have the pleasure of featuring an article that was just recently published in the spring 2023 issue of PSQ, entitled The 2022 Elections, A Test of Democracy's Resilience and the Referendum Theory of Midterms. We have with us the author of the article, Professor Gary Jacobson. Professor Jacobson is Distinguished Professor of Political Science Emeritus at the University of California, San Diego. He specializes in the study of U.S. elections, parties, campaign finance, public opinion, and Congress. And his most recent book is Presidents and Parties in the Public Mind. Professor Jacobson, thank you for being with us. Welcome.
Thank you.
Also with us is Professor Danielle Thompson. She's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. She studies American politics, U.S. Congress, elections, and gender and politics. Her book, Opting Out of Congress, Partisan Polarization and the Decline of Moderate Candidates, examines the rise of partisan polarization in Congress. Welcome, Professor Thompson.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Our event will begin with a presentation of the article by Professor Jacobson, followed by a discussion and comments on that article by Professor Thompson. And after that, audience members will have an opportunity to enter questions, and those questions will be related to both of our panelists and will be answered. So I encourage you all, as you are watching, if something prompts a question, please go ahead and use the question and answer feature at the very bottom of your screen to enter your question. Professor Jacobson, we're eager to hear your presentation and begin with you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Mary-Lena, and thank you, Bob, for inviting me to do this. And thank you for the audience that showed up that might be interested in this. The paper is on the 2022 midterm elections, which I see as having tested both American democracy's resilience and the political scientists' referendum theory of midterm elections. And as I say in the title, democracy meets the test better than the theory. The Democrats lost far fewer House seats than the referendum models predicted, given on the basis of Biden's relatively low popularity in the low 40s, high inflation, real income decreases, and a generally very unhappy electorate. These conditions had fueled widespread anticipation, especially among Republican leaders and conservative pundits, of a red wave that would give Republicans solid control of the House and control of the Senate as well. In the end, the Republicans won an additional 9 House seats, which reversed the Democrats' 222 to 213 majority to a 222 to 213 Republican majority. And Democrats actually picked up a seat in the Senate to break the 50-50 tie. So it was a far less of a referendum than was expected. And my paper documents that failure and then offers several explanations for it, none of them mutually exclusive. First, to the failure. The referendum theory of midterms, which is widely supported by prior research, is that voters in aggregate tend to treat midterm elections as a referendum on the administration, collectively rewarding or punishing the president's party's congressional candidates for its perceived successes or failures. And the things they look at are how well the president's doing with the public, how well the economy's doing, whether we're at war or not, things that are a kind of global import to voters. The standard kind of political science model, which I've used for years on this, estimates the seat swing for the president for against the president's party as a function of the president's approval in the final Gallup poll before the election, which in Biden's case was 40 points, 40% approving. Changes in the real disposable income over the year leading up to the election, which is very tricky to measure this year, but I made a guesstimate of a negative 1%. And that's combined with a kind of a measure of how many seats the party already holds. The more seats you have, the more you have to lose. So you have to take into account how many seats the party holds before you look at how many it's going to lose. First slide, please. In the past, in articles in the Political Science Quarterly, I've used the model to estimate a predicted seat swing and an actual seat swing. And I looked over the last 5 times I've done this, often is buried in the footnote. As I don't see it as normally central. But in the previous elections through 2002 to 2018, you can see that the prediction was actually pretty dead on. They missed by a relatively small percentage point, percentage and a relatively small number. Then you look at 2022, and it's off. The prediction was 47 seats, and I tinkered with the model, and most of the tinkering had more than 47 seats as the prediction. This was a kind of conservative estimate. The actual was 9, so we're off by 38 seats, which in statistical terms is 3 standard deviations off the prediction. That it was just simply wildly off. This was true of other models based on the political and economic fundamentals. I heard some delivered at the APSA meetings last year ago fall. And all the ones that looked at the fundamentals suggest that the Republicans would have a great year. There were other projections that were based on survey research, surveys of pre-election preferences of voters, and those didn't look nearly as bad for the Democrats. And those models that took the surveys into account were actually quite accurate in predicting the election. Next slide, please. And one of the weird things about the 2022 election is this disjunction between vote intentions, which are the solid lines on this graph, Democrats in blue, Republicans red, independents in green. They're pretty stable and over the course of the election, not much change. Democrats slightly favored in these polls in the brown line overall. But you can see from this is as Biden's numbers declined, intentions to vote Democratic didn't decline anywhere nearly as much. And indeed, Democratic voting intentions among all respondents were about 10 points above Biden's approval rating over the course of the entire election year, about 8 points over the last 3 months. You compare that to other big swing elections like 2018, 2006, 1994. Usually there's a gap of 3 or 4 points between the vote intentions and presidential approval. This was a gap of 8 points. It was also, especially an unusually large gap for independents, the green lines here. Independents lost faith in Biden. His approval rating among them was down in the low 30s as election day approached, and yet their voting intentions were close to being 50-50. In some of the some post-election surveys, the independents actually voted majority for the Democrat, and others they didn't. On average, he did better among independents than Democrats did better among independents than Republicans. And again, that's in strong contrast to previous years with big election swings, which normally the swing is with the independents, where the winning party is a 10, 12, 14 point digit lead in the post-election polls. So on the unusual behavior independents in 2022, plus extremely high levels of party line voting that I'll talk about later, 95, 96% among Democrats and Republicans, are the proximate reasons why the referendum model fails in 2022. Overall, the consistency between opinions of the president's performance and the vote performance in 2022 were pretty high. 89% of people who had an opinion about the president voted in that way in the House election. That is, if they approved of the president, they voted for the Democrat. If they disapproved, they voted for the Republican. This was down from a consistency rating of 93% for Donald Trump in 2018, which was the highest we've ever observed. It was still pretty high. But what happened was that the inconsistencies favored the Democrats. Those voters who disapproved of Biden very strongly voted overwhelmingly for the Republican. Those who approved of Biden strongly voted overwhelmingly for the Democrat. But those who just approved somewhat a bit of Biden voted for the Democrat at about 92% rate. But those who had a negative view of Biden, but it wasn't a strongly negative view, still voted majority Democratic in the House election. So you had a lot of people who were unhappy with Biden, but nonetheless stuck with the Democrat, didn't vote for the Republican in retaliation. The question is why? Why did enough voters set aside their unhappiness with Biden and the economy and the nation's direction to deny Republicans their red wave? And I think the answer, there are three parts to the answer. One is Donald Trump and his big lie. Another is the Supreme Court's ruling that in Dobbs that overturned Roe v. Wade. And third, what has been described by some political scientists as the calcification of the current American electorate that sharply limits the share of voters willing to cross party lines for any reason. To begin with Trump and his influence in the Republican primaries. As everyone knows now, since losing his bid for re-election in 2020, Trump has persisted in claiming that the vote count in swing states was rife with fraud and that he, not Biden, was the legitimate winner. Now, this is the most thoroughly investigated and exhaustively debunked of Donald Trump's numerous lies. But large majorities of Republicans, about 2/3 consistently, and even larger majorities of Trump voters, around 70% upwards, continue to subscribe to the big lie. So the credulity of Republicans and Trump voters and their devotion to Trump that it symbolized made him a major faction and made him a major factor, and his big lie major factor in the Republican primary politics and ultimately in the election. Endorsing the big lie was a way of getting Trump's endorsement and then thus the backing of his supporters who make up a majority of the Republican electorate. About 70% of the Trump endorsees were big lie advocates. Along with cynical opportunists, there were apparently a number of true believers as well, including a number of candidates for state and local offices who would be responsible for managing elections and counting votes in the future. The analysts at 538 conducted a comprehensive survey. Next slide, please. A comprehensive survey of candidates' standings with regard to the big lie. And a larger proportion fully denied Biden's legitimacy than fully accepted among Republicans, with others falling in between. So the notion that the election was fraudulent and stolen was widespread among Republican candidates. Trump's involvement in the campaign had, I think, three effects. First, his intervention on behalf of big lie supporters helped to saddle the Republicans with inexperienced and flawed Senate candidates in several of the most competitive states, and I would include Arizona, Georgia, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, also in some swing House districts. Second, the endorsement of the stolen election myth by so many Republican candidates also allowed Democrats, most prominently led by Joe Biden, to argue that the fate of American democracy was on the ballot, that you had to vote against people who had worked to overturn a fair and free national election and thwart the will of the American voters. Thirdly, it also put Trump himself into the decision calculus and on the ballot, if not on the ballot. The more the election was treated as a referendum on Trump as well as Biden, or as on a choice, or as a choice between the two, the better for the Democrats. Trump's great popularity among Republicans was substantially outweighed by his greater unpopularity among everyone else. For example, there were an average of six Economist YouGov polls taken in September and October and November of 2022. 44% in the poll were registered Republicans, and 78% of them expressed favorable views of Trump. But 56% were not registered Republicans, and 82% of that group expressed negative views of Trump. So Trump was a net negative overall. In addition to Trump, number two was the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. Trump was also, of course, partly responsible for this because it was his appointees that joined the majority that overturned Roe v. Wade. And it was the second factor that kept the election from being a straightforward a second factor that kept the election from being a straightforward referendum on Biden and the economy. A great majority of Democrats are pro-choice, as are most independents, and most of them strongly oppose the Supreme Court's decision. With abortion rights coming under threat by Republicans in Congress and half the state legislatures, and the issue itself on the ballot in several states, Democrats, especially Democratic women, had a new incentive to be heard at the polls, helping to offset the discontent they might have felt with Biden and his economy, things that might have discouraged them going to the polls. The overturning of Roe v. Wade had the opposite effect, mobilizing turnout. The third factor, the calcified electorate, also blunted the referendum, and it probably would have blunted any referendum. It reflects the high rigidity in electoral behavior that's been created by extreme levels of partisan polarization, called calcification by Sides, Stasanovich, and Vavrik in their account of the 22 election. Simply put, the idea is that partisans have become so polarized and mutually hostile that very few will consider crossing party lines for any reason, which will blunt the effect of any national force, including a referendum. The growth in party line voting in generic polls is illustrated in the next slide, please. Over the course of the post-war period, but you can see, number one, that green line is just the average in party loyalty. It reached a low point in the 80s. It's now reached a high point in this most current election. And you can also know if you look at the blue and the red figures, that previously in big swing elections, there was a clear distinction that the party of an unpopular president, its adherents deserted more. The party of a popular president, or the party of the rival party of the president's party, had fewer deserters in those big swing elections. If you look at 74, 2006, 2010, 2014, it even happens in 2018 on a smaller scale. You can see this gap shrinks over time as the electorate becomes more calcified. But in 2020, there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats, something that has never happened before in any election where there was a major wave one way or the other. Calcification is also evident in the very high levels of continuity between voting in 2020 and 2022. Something like 95% of the voters in 2022 voted the same way they said they had voted for president in 2020. Again, that's the highest figure has ever been recorded in polls. Next slide, please. On a number of other measures, it was an extraordinarily consistent election with an incredible, extraordinary continuity with what happened in 2020 and previously. The correlation between the vote, the presidential level, and the House races, 0.98. That's amazingly high. The proportion of seats that won by the party of the prior presidential winner, 95%. The value of incumbency, which used to be on the order of 6, 8, 10, 12 points, is down to a point or so, almost insignificant. Correlation with the presidential and Senate vote up to 0.962. That 100 on the seats won by the party is wrong. It should be 97. There was one that went the other way. That's a mistake. It's a mistake that's going to be in the journal too, and I apologize for it. But it's 97, not 100. Nonetheless, these are remarkably high figures, showing the extreme level of continuity and consistency. I then go on in the paper after pointing out these three possible, non-competitive, non-competing explanations of why it was not a referendum election. I go into some details on this. I won't show you all the charts on that, but my analysis indicates that Trump's endorsees tend to do 3 or 4 points worse than other Republican candidates when you take things like local partisanship, campaign spending, incumbency status into account. Either Trump's endorsement turned off some voters, or I think more likely, he endorsed candidates who were generally inferior candidates, and it showed up at the poll. But it's also true, especially in the Senate races that were competitive, and where election deniers were running. These races were astonishingly expensive, and the Republicans outspent the Democrats. The Democrats outspent the Republicans by a substantial amount, on the order of something between $13 and $130 million across 6 of those elections, which I think is testimony as to how partisan passions had stimulated investments in Democrats in 2022. That Democrats had ample resources to reframe the election away from a focus on Biden and the economy onto issues of democracy, choice on abortion, and of course the individual shortcomings of some of the Republican candidates. The Trump effect was also visible in state elections, statewide elections. 6 of the 23 Republican candidates for Secretary of State denied Biden's legitimacy. It cost them an estimated 5.7 points, and they all lost. And that eliminated the threat they might have made to the vote count in 2024. Among governors, there were 2 election deniers in red states that won re-election easily, but there were also 5 election deniers among candidates for open seats. All of them lost. On average, they did 3 to 5 points worse than they should have, given the fundamentals. I also looked into the effect of the election denial and the Dobbs decision on individual voting in the ANES panel, in an ANES panel study. Next slide, please. And the survey asked a number of questions about how did overturning Roe v. Wade make you feel, and offered the opportunities as hopeful, angry, afraid, happy, worried, or outraged. Anger had the strongest relationship to the House vote. You look across the top, people that the proportion voting for the Democrat increases with anger with the court. It happens among Democrats, independents, and Republicans as well. Next slide, please. And then if you put it into a multivariate model that includes other things like affect the vote, like party identification, ideology, views of the economy, whether denying the election or not, anger over Roe v. Wade. And all of these, by the way, are standardized coefficients. You can use the effect measure to the right of each coefficient, which tells you what the effect of going to the highest to the lowest value on this on the variable on the probability of voting for the Democrat. You can see what happens when you add Biden approval. Retrospective economy kind of disappears. These were the referendum elements in this model, Biden and the economy. If you add Trump, the presidential vote in 2020, that adds the continuity factor, the stability factor, and then includes Biden approval. You can see that anger over Roe reversal continues to have a robust effect, controlling for all of these other things. So I think it's pretty clear that the Dobbs decision worked to dampen any referendum elements in there. So to sum up, the 2020 midterm tested both American democracy's resilience and the referendum theory of midterm elections. Democracy clearly met the test better than the theory. Democrats lost far fewer House seats than referendum models or many pundits predicted. Trump's meddling in nomination politics on behalf of his big lie and the court's Dobbs decisions put democracy and abortion rights on the agenda, mobilizing Democrats and redefining what was at stake in the election. The referendum was also blunted by hardened political attitudes that minimized partisan defections and by independents who voted for Democrats despite negative views of Biden. The overall patterns show record levels of continuity and cohesion in 2022, reiterating the stark political divisions that have emerged over the past decade or two. Finally, the forces shaping the 22 election remain alive and potent going into 2024, with Trump pursuing the White House with even more flagrant mendacity than ever, abortion policy more unsettled by the day, and upcoming battles in Washington offering little prospects of easing party polarization and mutual hostility. So where we are now is where we're going. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jacobson. Your presentation has generated some excellent questions, and they are in our Q&A chart, but they will stay there until we hear from Professor Thompson. So we move on to Professor Thompson, and then we could return to these questions at the end. And I encourage you all, as you listen in and a question comes to mind prompted by these great comments, please feel free to put in our Q&A section. Professor Thompson.
So first, I want to start by thanking Bob for the invitation to be here today. And I want to thank Gary for writing such a terrific article on the 2022 elections. It's a real pleasure to be here talking about these issues with you all. Before I dive in, I want to start by noting that it is really hard to overstate how much we learn about congressional elections from Gary Jacobson. He has an unparalleled ability to synthesize the many moving parts of an election and provide us with a data-driven overview of the central forces at work. This article follows in that tradition to showcase the factors that mattered in the 2022 midterms. He combines an impressive array of data, including polling numbers, surveys, and election outcomes to explore Democrats' overperformance relative to expectations. In particular, he highlights how Trump's meddling and the Dobbs decision put democracy and abortion on the ballot, which mobilized Democrats, attracted independents, and amplified the stakes of the election. One characteristic feature of Jacobson's work is the use of incredibly compelling nuggets of data that speak volumes. Take, for example, his discussion of the unusually wide gap between presidential approval and voting intentions, or the fact that even as Biden's ratings declined, House preferences changed very little. Jacobson notes that Biden's approval ratings among independents were in the low 30s for much of the year, but independents nonetheless gave House Democrats a majority of their votes. This stands in stark contrast to other wave elections where the winning party enjoyed a 12 to 18-point advantage among independents. Independent voters also favored the Democrat in every competitive Senate race except Wisconsin's. So not only did Democratic voters stay put and support the Democrats, independent voters also gave Democrats uncharacteristically high levels of support. So the rest of the article explains why voters set aside their unhappiness with Biden, the economy, and the direction of the country to deny Republicans the red wave. Jacobson delves into three main factors, two of which I'm going to talk about for most of the time. First, threats to democracy and abortion rights. He finds that in general elections, Democratic vote shares increased when Republican incumbents denied that Biden won, and when Democratic incumbents ran against a Republican with a Trump endorsement. He finds that in open seats, Democratic vote shares also increased when the Republican candidate was endorsed by Trump. So these results are fascinating, though I couldn't help but tie our discussion to Jacobson's prior work and ask whether the election deniers vanished. To the contrary, it seems like the election truth tellers were the ones who vanished, and it's hard not to see the electoral penalty that was associated with crossing Trump. Only 2 of the 10 Republican members of Congress who voted for impeachment were reelected, and the rest lost in the primary or opted to retire. In an era where so few general elections are decided by close outcomes, how much does a couple of percentage points in vote shares really matter for who is elected to office? So are we talking about an increase in Democratic vote shares from 63% or 60% to say 63%, or a decrease in Republican vote shares from 61% to 59%? So I wondered whether the outcome of interest shouldn't be election to office. I know there's not much variation on this, of course, but I do think it's the outcome that we care about most. In the next few slides, I'm going to be drawing on data that were generously shared with me by no one other than Gary Jacobson himself after a very last-minute request from me. So I wanted to include a quick note of thanks on the data front. I think 6 election deniers who sought re-election vanished, but for different reasons like scandals or redistricting, with 3 of the 6 losing in the general election. But the vast majority stayed. So of the 113 Republican incumbents who fully denied the election, 110 were re-elected to office. So these graphs break down election denialism by Republican incumbents in the left graph in uncompetitive districts where Trump received more than 55% of the vote share in 2020. And in the right graph in competitive districts where Trump received less than 55% of the presidential vote share in 2020. So of course, unsurprisingly, the number of office holders from uncompetitive districts is higher. We can also see that election deniers make up a greater share of those elected in safe Republican districts than those elected in more competitive districts. So of those elected, the Republican incumbents re-elected in safe districts, 68% fully denied the 2022 election compared to 37% of those re-elected in competitive districts. So what this means is that any path to their defeat would certainly be an uphill one. And we can see here that an additional 14 deniers were elected in open seats, so more entered office as well. Of all 222 Republicans who were elected in 2022, 125 or 56% fully denied the outcome of the 2020 election. Another 13% didn't comment or they raised questions, and 19% accepted the outcome with reservations. Only 26 GOP winners, or 12%, fully accepted the outcome of the 2020 election. So election deniers are alive and well in Congress today. To me, though, there is another bright spot with respect to the resilience of democracy that Jacobson gives less attention to. So I think one reason why 2022 brought some sighs of relief is that Republican candidates who believed in the big lie also conceded their losses, and they did so pretty quickly. So there seems to be a distinction in Republican candidates saying that Trump won in 2020 and believing that they too would hold office without winning the most votes. Both of these are, of course, problematic for democracy, but I think the quick concessions of the 2020 election deniers were enormously important for our understanding of the significance of 2022 with respect to the resilience of democracy. So overall, it seems like the incumbent election deniers did not vanish. The incumbent truth tellers did, but the election deniers who lost did not deny their own losses, which is a positive sign for democracy, albeit an admittedly low bar. A minor comment is that I would have also liked to see abortion on the ballot incorporated into the analyses of election outcomes. The way that people talked about abortion being on the ballot was whether the election of a Democratic governor would thwart efforts by a Republican state legislature to ban abortion. And it was the main reason posited for why we saw states moving in different directions, with very blue California and New York resembling a more typical midterm year and supporting Republican candidates. The individual level analyses, like Gary showed, do include preferences on abortion, but the shift of states in different directions was a pretty unique feature of 2022. And it raises a host of new questions, ranging from state variation in campaign strategy to the polling of voters who reside in states with different state politics and the association between partisan control of state governments and federal election outcomes. The fundraising numbers that Jacobson lays out are also staggering. He shows that in Senate races in battleground states, Democratic candidates and groups spent an average of $132 million, and Republicans spent an average of $91 million. He shows that spending reached a high of $422 million in Georgia alone. So we know that partisan control of legislative institutions is paramount, but fundraising and spending is much higher today than it was in prior elections where partisan control was also up for grabs. So it's one thing to say that voters should have sufficient knowledge to make informed choices, but it's not obvious that the constant ratcheting up of raising and spending more and more money is leading to significantly more informed voters. Campaign receipts are, however, guiding and structuring much of the pre-election conversation. And these eye-popping totals really make you wonder what warrants this much spending and what are the downsides of such steep costs of elections. So one last big picture comment to think about going into 2024. A puzzle to emerge from 2022 is why Republicans are unable to capitalize on favorable electoral conditions, particularly in Senate races. Most of the reasons for why Republicans didn't pick up as many seats as expected are rooted in Republicans either taking unpopular positions or nominating unpopular or low-quality candidates. They seem on track to nominate Trump for the top of the ticket despite his liabilities, and a couple of the underperforming GOP candidates in 2022 are considering another run. There is some evidence that Republicans are mindful of electoral wins, and recent media coverage has suggested that House Republicans are punting on a national abortion ban amid fears of a 2024 backlash. To be sure, the hardening of partisan loyalties, or what Gary referred to as the calcification of American politics, means that most districts and states are safe for one party and they will remain safe in 2024. So the unknowns will be at the margins, whether in the small number of competitive states and districts, partisans will turn out, and whether the small number of independents will support Democrats like they did in 2022 if Republicans continue to nominate candidates that struggle to attract support. Or whether Republicans will learn from past elections and adopt a different strategy, particularly since they're now controlling the reins in the House. Congressional elections raise new questions about American politics with each cycle, but hopefully Republican candidates and office holders will at least move past election denialism in 2024 and beyond. I want to thank Gary again for the insightful paper, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Thompson, for excellent commentary generated by a very stimulating piece, clearly. Professor Jacobson, do you care to respond to any of the comments made, or?
Well, I thank Danielle for her comments and for a careful reading of the paper and for plowing through my data. I think she's right. Of course, looking at election deniers in people who election acceptors in the Republican Party, it was a losing proposition. 8 of the 10 are gone, and it was pretty clear early on that they were going to be gone. And I don't think that election denial hurt Republican incumbents very much, if at all. But I think it did dampen the enthusiasm for for Republicans who were not incumbents. And where they lost out on the possibility of a red wave was that they were unable to pick up seats that were already held by Democrats. And I think that the focus on election integrity from the Democratic side made it much harder for them to take those seats. I mean, they reminded everybody, all those people who showed up in 2020 to vote Trump out of office, who might have been discouraged by Biden's performance, by the economy, were given a new reason to go back to the polls. You got to vote against Trump again. He's there. He mobilizes Democrats more effectively than anybody, any other political figure in history, as far as I can tell. He mobilizes Republicans as well, but he mobilizes the opposition even more. With regard to election deniers, well, you can't overlook Kerry Lake. There are, in one state, in Arizona, a couple of the losers claim the election was stolen. But you're right; it wasn't a widespread reaction, and I think there was a certain chastisement that took place among Republicans when they discovered that what they thought was going to be a great year was a lousy year, and it was probably not a good time to claim that it was just because the election was stolen from them. There's some other things I could say, but I think we should open it up to our questioners.
Yeah, would be happy to do so. So we have a few questions that I will share with you. The first one reads as follows. I thought that your article was clear and convincing, but one factor that you did not address was the recent trend of both parties to nominate weak candidates and/or candidates with big liability. And a follow-up question related to that is, will the parties learn to avoid such weak and vulnerable candidates?
Okay, well, I think, yeah, the problem for the parties is they don't necessarily control what kind of candidates they get. As parties, and you think of parties as organizations, party leaders, the committees in Congress, they have to deal with primary electorates. And primary electorates in recent years have been amenable to electing fairly extreme candidates, especially in primaries where there are a multiple number of candidates. When a candidate who is kind of outstanding in the strongest positions on the party side is likely to get more attention, maybe more money, and win in these primaries where the turnout's generally 15 to 30%. So I think party leaders would, if they could, and you listen to Mitch McConnell from time to time on this, would, if they could, shape the nominating process to weed out those candidates who can't win seats that ought to have been winnable for the party. But it's not a lot the party can do as long as we have a primary system, and as long as there are outside groups, which there are now, that are willing to spend and invest in highly ideological candidates. The parties don't control the resources anymore. The outside spending groups have a lot more in their hands to influence outcomes if they choose to do so. So I think the parties would like to nominate more electable candidates in every race they can, but they can't always get their way. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Professor Thompson, do you want to add anything to that response?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on what Gary said. So the parties are certainly constrained by who won or who runs, who turns out, a bunch of factors that they can't control. I do wonder, though, if the parties will question their historically hands-off official approach under the with the rationale of winning elections. I do think that in Senate races, the focus is on a smaller number of contests, and they could weigh in a little bit more given the stakes. But with McCarthy making concessions not to be involved in open house seats, that seems to be like a step in the other direction that would complicate Republican Party involvement even more than it is currently.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a strategic capitulation on McCarthy's part. Think about this. If you're a Republican candidate in a primary election, whose endorsement would you rather have, Donald Trump's or Mitch McConnell's and Kevin McCarthy's? It's
Questionably Trump.
yeah, it's a question that answers itself, and that's the problem from the party's perspective, because those candidates that get Trump's endorsement are harder to elect in swing states and swing districts.
On the topic of candidates, we have a related question, or a question related to this question of candidates. So the question reads as follows: Republican candidates receive more money support from dark money groups. Has anyone added use of those funds to the overall expenditures on behalf of each candidate?
Yes, the numbers that Danielle referred to and that are in the paper include both outside spending and candidate spending. And it's interesting that on candidate spending, the Democrats in these competitive Senate races far outstripped the Republican candidates in fundraising and spending on the candidate side. The only reason that it was close was that outside groups evened things up. The amount coming from outside groups was about the same for Republicans and Democrats. So for several of the Republican candidates, they would not have been competitive without this outside money. So yes, it is indeed included in the analyses. It's a kind of disadvantage to having outside money rather than party money, simply because party money can be used much more efficiently. You get the lowest possible TV costs if you're a candidate. If you're an outside group, you pay the going freight, which is much higher. So it's an advantage to have more of your money controlled by the candidate than by outside groups. But the candidate fundraising was also another kind of sign of how excited Democrats got after Roe v. Wade. If you look at small individual contributions, the Democrats did very, very well. Sort of the Act Blue gang, the people who click and give $100 once in a while. Democrats did much better at that than Republicans did, and I think that at least part of the reason is how mobilized Democrats were by political conditions involving Trump and Roe v. Wade.
Speaking of issues, I'm sorry. Go right ahead. Go ahead, Danielle.
Well, I'll just quickly add on the point of the balance between outside money and candidate spending. So what this could suggest is that the efficiency of Republican spending is lower or dampened, both because of these differences in rates and also because I would imagine they're less constrained, or they're less able to control the narrative or to standardize the party messaging when it's not coming from candidate spending itself. I did want to follow, I think the question was also talking about dark money. And as far as I'm aware, we don't have, so I've talked to the people at the FEC about dark, and the only way you can even, it's housed in the IRS. So it's not even, they don't work with any dark money data. So our understanding of is, I mean, Gary, correct me, but as far as I'm aware, most of our understanding of money is based on almost exclusively non-dark money.
I'd have to check. I think the Center for Responsive Politics collects data on dark money from the IRS, as well as non-dark money from the FEC, from Federal Election Commission. So I think the numbers that I cranked my numbers out of their numbers, and I think they include dark money. Dark money has to be reported somewhere, sometime. It's just not reported through the same kinds of channels, and we don't know who it comes from. So it's harder to do the kinds of analyses to see whether politicians are doing the bidding of their contributors or not.
Another question that we have deals more with issues salient to the midterm. So the question is the following: were Social Security and/or Medicare salient issues in the 2022 midterm?
I think much less so than in 2018, because that was an election where Democrats were on the offensive. Republicans had been running the Congress. There were perceived threats to Social Security. There had been attacks on Obamacare, on the Affordable Care Act that were very unpopular. And so those kinds of issues were front and center in 2018. I think they were less front and center in 2022, simply because Republicans learned from 2018 that attacking these things was a loser, at least in competitive races. So you didn't. I mean, I don't recall hearing any attacks on Obamacare. There must have been some somewhere, but it was not an issue in the way it had been in 2018 or earlier, because over time it's become more and more acceptable, more and more popular, and it becomes more and more of a losing proposition to attack it. So that may not be the case in 2024, depending on who gets the nomination. Trump sort of tries to take that off the table, so he's not going to cut Social Security, but Obamacare, who knows? And certainly the Democrats routinely use those issues to mobilize people, saying that Republicans are, just as they exist as Republicans, are a threat to Medicare and Medicaid. And we'll see how the budget deals going on in Congress these days feed into or detract from that theme on the Democratic side going into the next election.
It certainly seems like the Democrats want to talk about that in 2024. If you watched Biden's campaign launch video,
they always want to talk about that. This is that's bread and butter.
Yeah,
to Democrats. Yeah.
Another question takes us in a little bit of a different direction. How would the article's findings, arguments explain or interpret the effect of the major news outlets, talk shows, and social media on the outcome of the 2022 election?
I don't know. There are people who collect and analyze all of the campaign ads, and they're starting to do that for 2022. I don't know of any definitive findings on that. I don't think there's any kind of systematic measurement of what goes on in the social media, certainly, and even on the talk shows and so forth. They tend to be reflections of what's going on rather than movers of what's going on. They want to talk about what their audience is interested in, and so it depends on what their audience seems to be interested in, what they're going to say. But this is one of the things that's really hard for political scientists to study: media effects. My dissertation was on radio and television spending in campaigns back in the 1950s and 1960s. And it was pretty fugitive data then. It's still pretty fugitive data in the sense of trying to find some kind of systematic measures that allow you to assess the impact. What we can say is that in very competitive races, the kind that sort of make a difference one way or another, it is almost invariable that there's so much information out there about the candidates on both sides, positive and negative, that the volume of information isn't going to be the decisive thing. That is, if you look at those very expensive Senate races, saturated advertising. Everybody knew who the candidates were. Everybody knew what their positions were, what to say good about them, what to say bad about them. It wasn't like there was any ignorance among the voters out there. And so when that's the case, when there's total saturated coverage and everybody kind of hears all the messages, then it's the messages themselves that become decisive, not their volume.
I could move on to the next question. What have citizens who donated to Trump's big lie denial felt about the recent settlement of the voting machine company versus Fox?
I don't know yet. We haven't seen that. But if you look at the numbers on, say, election denial and support for Trump, they don't change. There's a kind of dip right after the January riots and the Capitol invasion. And then it kind of pops up to another equilibrium, and it's not entirely, but almost all flat since then. So almost nothing changes people's opinions anymore on things having to do with Trump and having to do with the election. There may be a 6 or 8 point erosion in support for the big lie among Republicans. I mean, it's gone from 72% to 65%, 63%, something like that. So it's not like nothing has happened, but very little has happened. For another paper, I'm looking at the effects of the hearings that were held last June and July on people's attitudes toward things having to do with the insurrection on January 6th. almost no effects. A little bit of movement, a little bit more suspicion that Trump was involved, et cetera. But by and large, people's attitudes are just frozen on this. That's part of the rigidification of your partisanship. You stick with your team no matter what. And I think that's the state we're in right now.
We have a couple of questions reflecting forward to 2024, but before I get to those, let me go back to one of the original ones. Are Republicans declining as a percentage of the electorate? If so, how does that impact traditional party-based analysis?
No, they're not. The distribution of partisans has been pretty steady. Different polls show ups and downs, but if you look at them all together, it's pretty much parties are pretty closely balanced. The Democrats have a slight advantage. Over the long run, if we believe in demographic change, and if we believe that people keep the partisanship they develop in their first decade or so involved in politics, voting, and elections, then the long-term prospects for the Republicans are somewhat worse than for the Democrats, because if you look at people who are under 30, there are far more Democrats than Republicans. And assuming that they stay there, then as people in my generation age out of the electorate and get younger people coming in, forming a larger proportion of it, that's going to favor the Democrats. But we've been noticing that for 10 or 15 years. It hasn't happened much yet. But there is something inexorable about demography. It doesn't mean the Republicans can't pick up some of those younger voters, but their emphasis on social issues seems to counter that possibility, since the youngest generation is socially pretty liberal, pretty comfortable with gays and with trans and so forth. So the themes that work for older Republicans don't work very well with younger Republicans, and that seems what they're emphasizing in this right now. Anyway, we'll see what happens in 2024.
Speaking of 2024, we have a couple of questions kind of heading in that direction. The first one is the following. Given that the Republicans picked up a good number of House seats in 2020 and only added 9 since they had already picked up vulnerable seats in 2020, and given that the Democrat vulnerabilities in the Senate and current economic and other problems for Biden, aren't the Republicans poised to recapture the House and the Senate, even if they lose the presidency in 2024?
I would be very surprised if they lost the presidency and won the House, just simply because these things are so highly correlated these days. It's possible, could happen. The Senate, the Democrats have an uphill battle just because of the set of seats that are up this time around. They had a pretty favorable distribution in 2022. They're going to have a much worse distribution in 2024. So they do have to worry about losing the Senate and the House. And it's no guarantee that the Republicans aren't going to win the presidency. We're a very evenly divided nation right now. You've got 2 candidates, both of which large majorities say they don't want to run again, who are likely to be the ones running against each other. In circumstances where things are very, very close between the parties, what turns out to matter most is turnout, who mobilizes their supporters best. Democrats won that battle in the last 3 elections, and they will have to win that battle again if they hope to win in 2024. If they do, then that filters down to their House candidates as well. Not so much to the Senate candidates, which operate on a slightly different scale. But the one thing I've learned in doing this for 40 years now is it's really hard to predict what's going to happen this far out in any election. I'm endlessly surprised, and therefore I'm no longer surprised at being surprised. I was surprised by this election. I thought Republicans would do better than they did.
And I think that answers one of the questions, which was, what does your study tell about the newly announced Biden campaign? Although you could reflect further if you like. Another question is asking whether your forecast, with respect to the 2024 election, whether that is applicable to both the presidential election and the elections that result in control of the House and the Senate, or just one or more of those elections?
Well, the House and the presidency tend to move pretty closely together. The Senate is not always dead on with the rest, although in recent elections it's been pretty close. But in Senate elections, people do split their tickets a little bit more. They almost never do in the House now, but 95% vote straight party line. In the Senate, it may be 92%, but in some states it may be 89, 88%. So you get a bit more play there, and then more uncertainty because you can't really game it out until you know who the candidates are and what their strengths and weaknesses are. To a certain extent, that's true in the House, but the focus has to be there on just those relatively small number of districts, maybe 40 or 50, that are potentially competitive. And again, you don't want to make judgments about that until you look at see who gets the nominations. Danielle knows this. Who gets the nominations, how much money they've got, et cetera. So it's totally risky or impossible really to predict the outcomes of national elections these days, simply because we're so evenly balanced that they could go either way. And small things or big things that happen between now and election day can make a difference.
Speaking of elements, I'm sorry, go right ahead.
I'll just add to a point of Gary's is that, it's this risky world of predicting elections, in part because, what Gary just said about being closely divided, but also like majorities being so slim, and it makes it very difficult to be able to predict who's going to be in majority control in the House and Senate. One point that Gary raised before that I do think has the ability to shake up the electorate. We don't have much historical reason to believe that they will do this, but Gen Z, I think, does have the potential to shake up the electorate. They probably won't vote, like they haven't voted in the past, but Republicans aren't really giving Gen Z any incentive or reason at all to support them on a number of issues that they care about. So things like climate change, things like abortion, things like social rights. So I think that in terms of the distribution of partisanship in a group of voters does have the potential, but we don't have a strong reason to believe that they will differ from prior elections where turnout has been lower than other age groups.
You cannot underestimate the importance of turnout as a factor.
Another one of our attendees is wondering whether attack ads are still common and effective as ever.
The literature on this is kind of mixed. Initially, attack ads were thought to hurt the attacker. It turns out not to be true. Attack ads tend to be more memorable, but the effect of any ad is very hard to assess. Even successful ad campaigns, the effects seem to go away within a week. That is, ads can kind of move people, but not very much and not for very long. So attack ads, positive ads, there's no systematic evidence that one or the other is consistently better or worse in affecting how people think.
And a final question. Senator Rick Scott developed a Republican blueprint during the 2022 election. He proposed cuts to entitlement. Did that have any effect on the election?
Probably not. It gave the Democrats something to remind people of their standard theme. The Republicans are after your Social Security and your Medicare. But Scott may have mentioned it, but I don't think the Republican candidates endorsed this. It wasn't a position that they took. So it wasn't particularly shrewd of him to make that an issue. But I don't think it was brought into the campaigns. Issues matter in campaigns, but they matter most when they're brought into the campaigns by the candidates, by the campaign material at the local level, as opposed to the national level. And I think in that case, there weren't full-scale attacks on Medicare and Social Security by Republicans. They're not that naive.
Professor Thompson, any further comments?
Well, I will just add one point that there is sort of this like two worlds of congressional elections. So they're like not 80 to 90% of elections we know with fair amount of certainty what the outcome will be just because of the partisanship of the district. And so few congressional elections are up for grabs today that they're really two different worlds. And what, Gary's fundraising analysis is, but also, other his calcification graphs really show that like these kinds of elections are very distinct from each other. And what we see with spending in the handful of very competitive states could not be more different from spending in Senate races in the harder and the more the less mysterious, more sure outcome sort of races. So it is sort of an interesting time to think about and to study elections, and coupled with the narrow, slim majorities, it does create this picture of congressional elections. It's kind of hard to get your head around. Like it's hard to have a clear and overarching picture when there really are really different worlds of congressional elections.
And of course, Danielle's doing serious work now on primaries and congressional primaries, and that's where so much of the action is really going to be. That should be the focus of the next discussion, congressional primaries at some point, because their influence on actually who shows up in Washington is extremely high.
Thank you both. If you have any final thoughts or comments, please share now before we reach the conclusion of the webinar. I, from my end, want to thank you both for joining us. We are very grateful. All of us at Political Science Quarterly and all of us at the Academy of Political Science are very grateful for your time and very thankful for this discussion, and very thankful for attendees for participating and for offering stimulating questions that I think made the webinar even more engaging and exciting than expected. So thank you all. Thank you both. Thank you to the attendees.
And thank you, Marilena, and thank Bob and Political Science Quarterly, which has published these articles over the years. It's been a wonderful outlet for my research, and it keeps me energized in wanting to study the next election. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. The Professor Jacobson's article, just a reminder to everyone, appears in our spring 2023 issue, and you could access that at psqonline.org, along with the remaining of the spring issue. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.